Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. Today is the May 12th and we have a really good lineup for today. Kicking it off will be Mr. John O'Laughlin with McDuff Lives and his guest Riley Waggaman. And then we have at noon, we have George Webb, who's still in Europe, with Housatonic Live. At 4 o'clock, we have Bill Taylor with Deep State Research. And then we have 5, the Duke Report with Peter Duke. Let's bring in John. Good morning, John. Good morning, Riley.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. Welcome everybody. And I'm John O'Laughlin. Welcome to Neighborhood News Studio. And if you're on my channel at McDuff Lives 3 or McDuff Got 2 Strikes, go to McDuff Lives 3. That's the other one. Welcome and thanks for being with us. Those of you watching the show recorded later, thank you for being part of our community as well. We are ready to get started. So let's go ahead and bring Riley Waggaman up on the screen and start our conversation. Hello, Riley.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me back.
Well, sure, man. It's a pleasure. You know, I enjoy our conversations, but I think it's very, very important that everybody understand that you really live in Moscow, Russia. You know, you're there for the you know, as a permanent resident, and you have lived there sometime. You have a good bit of experience as a journalist, and you keep your hand on the pulse of what's going on as best as anybody can do from your perspective. And I frankly, I've been shocked at how you are able to say things about, you know, the pandemic or pandemic, just joking, that we can't say here. My first question is, how is it that you in Russia can get away with saying things that get me censored in the United States? How does that work?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there is, I mean, Russia does have certain restrictions on speech like everywhere else, but I imagine just because I'm writing in English and not in Russian that probably I'm given a free pass. But I mean, obviously, I feel like, for example, on Twitter, right, you have a huge amount of censorship on certain safety elements of certain medical procedures. I feel like probably you could be more, you know, critical of the Russian end of that, just because we're not talking about the American pharmaceuticals, we're talking about the Russian medical establishment. So maybe that's like a little loophole for us in Russia. I don't know.
Well, you've been paying attention to it, and you've kind of done a series of reports at your Substack. And maybe I'd like to start with, let's do this. Well, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, you were part of a panel discussion on Whitney Webb's video, and there was 3 other panelists there, and you were of the opinion that the health regimen is as bad, at least in Russia, as it is in the West, or in the United States, and that, you know, that's an indication that Putin is allied, or at least going along with the WHO. Whereas a couple of the other panelists were like, no way. He's fighting the WHO. He wants to set us free from all that stuff. And I kind of like to start there, because in what I look at, my Twitter feed and my, you know, my resources, that debate seems to be very, very important. And folks that are willing to just say, well, Putin is a good guy and he's, you know, need to understand from the point of view of somebody with your perspective. So with that, tell us what's going on with regard to the World Health Organization, the imposition of mandatory jabs and mandatory other procedures that are connected to the program of the WHO, and how is that progressing or not progressing from in Russia generally and in your life?
Yeah, so maybe a good way to start, a place to start from is February 24th, which is when Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine. And I think that there was this perception in English language, independent media, among pundits, that this was sort of a signal that this was somehow connected with coronavirus and the WHO, and sort of a pushback against this global biosecurity state that was forming, and that in the preceding days and weeks there were claims put out that Putin had personally axed all of the COVID restrictions in Russia, and that there was this big sort of amazing rebellion against the World Health Organization, and this this clearly some sort of weird global health plot that Russia had played an important role in up to that point. Russia did roll back its QR codes. It was a process that began before the events in Ukraine. It began in early February, and you can't really pick a date and say like that's when it was decided to get rid of the QR codes. I mean, there are parts of Russia like Yakutia which still had some QR code rules until mid-April.
Now, explain what a QR code means.
Sorry, yeah. So basically, we're talking about these
Really
digital health passes, which in Europe and in Israel and other parts were called the Green Pass. And this was basically a digital ID that you had on your phone, usually, that showed either vaccination status or that you had a negative PCR test, and it would allow you to go to shops and businesses and so forth. And in fact, there were even in Russia, they even had some parts of Russia even required you to have this in order to go to a hospital for routine medical care. So it was quite severe in some parts of Russia. St. Petersburg, even in large cities like St. Petersburg and Kazan. In Kazan, they even required it to use public transportation, which is quite extraordinary. Anyway, this system was rolled back beginning in early mid-February, and it was a process that lasted. I mean, the last QR code rules were rolled back in mid-April, but most of them were gone, I would say, by mid-March. The thing, though, is that there are still mask rules in certain parts of Russia. There's still rules regarding compulsory vaccination for certain parts of the population. If you work in certain industries or if you're above a certain age, there are parts of Russia where they are now requiring, if you work in a certain sector, to get tested once a week for coronavirus. And you actually have the Russian health ministry is saying publicly that they expect another wave of coronavirus, and they're urging people, especially children, to get vaccinated. So this idea that Russia somehow dumped, the pandemic narrative and has broken free from it, I think this is a lie. Basically, I mean, it's totally inaccurate. Again, acknowledging that yes, it's less strict now, but I think that that's true all over the world. Like, for example, Israel, I know was one of the first countries to adopt one of these green passes, was extremely strict about it. And they actually dropped basically all of their QR code rules, I believe in the beginning of February. So weeks before Russia really started doing it in any meaningful way. So I don't really see any strong correlation here. My guess really is that by February, probably like in other parts of the world, these policies were becoming so unpopular and having severe socioeconomic consequences. I mean, I was reporting, for example, in early February, there were parts of Russia where they were hanging effigies of their regional governor from bridges, like because people were so angry. I mean, at least in part, with these COVID restrictions. So I imagine that's probably what motivated it. It was just the reality that people were really, really angry. So to sort of continue on this topic, though, um, there has been a grassroots campaign in Russia and also among a few politicians uh, to try to get Russia out of the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization is basically funded by all of the countries that are basically trying to destroy Russia right now. I mean, all the countries that basically all of the WHO's top funders, with the exception of China, is imposing hundreds of sanctions on Russia right now and doing everything they can to basically topple the Russian government. Like that's actively happening right now. And yet Russia is still part of this organization which formulates health policies. And while, you know, you're not necessarily required to follow all of them, Russia has been following the WHO's lead with pandemic restrictions and pandemic advisories. So it's quite an extraordinary situation. Recently, the State Duma the Speaker of the State Duma, a guy named Volodin, uh, basically asked lawmakers and relevant committees to explore Russia's relationship with the WHO, you know, to start exploring this idea. Well, okay, we're part of the WHO. What does this mean? What are our obligations? Is it necessary? I haven't heard any update on this. This happened in April. More recently, the WHO, a regional body of the WHO in Europe, voted to possibly move its regional office out of Moscow, and also on some other sanctions like refusing to hold meetings in Russia. That won't really change anything. It's mostly a symbolic sort of slap on the wrist. But what I found so interesting is that in response to this, the Russian government is just saying, "Oh, this is terrible. Please don't do this. We want to be part of the WHO. This is bad for global health." So it's quite telling, because you have a situation where you have the perfect opportunity. The WHO is you know, giving you a slap on the wrist, and in response, you're not saying, well, this organization is trash anyway. We don't need to be part of this. This organization is funded by all of our open enemies who openly talk about destroying us. Instead, they're saying, this is such a tragedy. Please don't do this. So it's disappointing. Let's be honest. It's very disappointing to see what's happening, and I really do believe that it's silly to talk about an independent, sovereign Russia when you're taking advice from the World Health Organization. It just doesn't work. That how can you be sovereign if you don't have sovereignty over your own health? You know, so
Isn't that the bottom line? I mean, even, you know, my friends at the Schiller Institute, they talk a lot about sovereignty, you know, how important it is that we get back to the Peace of Westphalia, if you remember that historical precedent in which we can all agree to have different sovereign countries, that certain rules apply within the country, and then without turning us into a one world government, that we have diplomacy and we have ways to sort out problems. But we're all on we might not be in the same country, but we all have the same mind, and that is peace through development, peace through making the lives of our citizens better and better and better, and you know, help others when we can. But the idea that health is a world problem. Well, this has been pointed out by my great colleague Mark Kulaks at Housatonic Live, where he's showing that this concept called One Health is a cover story for really inserting health policy into the environment, into animals, into so that the animal kingdom, the environment, and humans are merged together into this one health system. And this idea is what generates the support for all of this totalitarian micromanagement and you know, just tracking of us and following our lives, seeing what we're doing on a daily basis. All of that comes from the idea of One Health, and that is the World Health Organization's basic mission, I think. that's where I can't agree with the Schiller Institute, because I think, if we're going to be sovereign, then the sovereignty of health sovereignty, belongs at home. I mean, to me, it's like a Russian doll. My health is up to me. If
Yeah.
I can't handle it, then it's up to my family. If they can't handle it, it's up to my community. And if they can't handle it, then let me call out to the world to say, how do we fix this health problem I have? But it starts with me. It doesn't start with somebody in an ivory tower in Geneva, Switzerland, saying, John O'Loughlin, this is what you need today. Bend over and pull down your pants.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this pandemic agreement that the WHO is working on is
Yeah,
a perfect example why this kind of system it's suicidal, really.
it
Uh,
is.
and this agreement, and it's so interesting. Dmitry Medvedev, who is former president and prime minister of Russia, who's now co-chair of the Security Council here. He wrote this incredible article in November where he said he gave the lessons of the pandemic, according to him. And one of them was, we need to give more power to the WHO. In times of global crisis, we should allow the WHO to dictate to Russia and the whole world how we respond to a global health crisis, which is crazy thing to say, especially if you're charged with the national security of your country. I mean, basically, he's arguing that Russia should hand the reins over to the Gates Foundation, the United States, Germany, like basically all of NATO, when there's a declared health crisis, and that Russia should have no say in how it's dealt with, which is just ridiculous. It's just a ridiculous thing to do. So, yeah, I mean, I mean, in general, I guess maybe I'm just too much of a rebel, but I mean, usually against centralization to begin with, but centralization of your health, of your bodily autonomy, to me, no, like I'm not on board with that in any way. So,
Yeah. Well, that's it. That's the dispute. And if we let them, have our health, then they control us completely. That's the end of what we think of as liberty. There ain't no more liberty if they can, throw a microwave beam at you and activate some little piece of garbage they've stuck in you 10 years ago. That's the end. And I don't see why people don't see that danger, but at least you do and I do, and we're on the opposite ends of the planet in a certain way. In thinking about Putin just for a moment, been interested in comment by Dr. Lee Merritt is her name, and she just has been studying the health issue from a point of view of a orthopedic surgeon, but she just tossed out that she happened to study Russian in school, and she was thinking, you know, I think Putin is a Romanov.
mm,
And I thought to myself, that's kind of interesting because he's from Petersburg, and that's basically the old empire. And you know, if the White Russians, not Bielorussia the state, but the White Russians that supported the whites in the Civil War, that the descendants of that tradition still exist in the world as a financial force, and I think that they do. If you look at places like Texas and the community around Lee Harvey Oswald back then, George de Mohrenschildt and all that. I don't know how much you've looked into that, but the idea of this quote White Russian power behind the scenes could reflect a kind of a war that is a collusion between the Putin powers and the Western powers in order to put a whole bunch of money into the oligarchs that are running Ukraine and basically running this war. So that when we say we got to spend another $33 billion on arms and send it to Ukraine, well, from a practical point of view, that sounds crazy, because if we send $33 billion worth of stuff into Ukraine, well, Russia's either going to seize it or destroy it pretty fast. And who's following the money? We could say we're spending $33 billion, but by the time it gets to Ukraine, it's only 1 billion because all the oligarchs stripped off their cuts. Um, I'm looking at the possibility of a huge collusion here that is simply a holdup when it comes right down to it. Is, we're going to keep this war going until you pay us X amount of $1 billion. Does that resonate with you at all?
I mean, I think without a doubt, there's going to be a huge chunk of this money that is, I mean, all of it obviously is being wasted because any dollar that goes towards armaments, in my opinion, is a bad investment, especially when I mean, especially in the United States where you have 20% of children live under the federal poverty line, which by the way is also true in Russia. So it's such a tragedy. It really is such a tragedy that we're spending all billions of dollars to kill people when we can't even feed our own kids, It's
Yeah.
disgusting. It's really disgusting, and undoubtedly a huge amount of this money is going into the pockets of, the usual suspects, oligarchy, obviously the Raytheons of the world. So it's just what a tragedy.
I,
It's absolutely tragic. It's absolutely tragic for, in my opinion, for both Russia and Ukraine, and who are Slavic brothers essentially. So it's heartbreaking.
yeah, it is. I mean, even from my point of view, I wish there was anything that I could do to stop it. That's why I keep thinking about it. But yeah, for you, it's personal, and for everybody over there, I send my sympathy and hopes for peace. Well, what else can we know now about the? Here's a question: the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab and all that. Now we see that connected to the World Health Organization, but maybe not as clearly and directly as you do if you really study it. But the World Economic Forum's fourth industrial revolution and all of that seems to be being set aside in favor of the war. What do you think? Is the WEF a player now, and how do they interact with Russia generally anyway?
Correct me if you know better, but I think that didn't they postpone their sort of annual Davos meeting? I think it's being held at the end of this month, right? Maybe like
They did
May
postpone it,
22nd.
yeah.
I think it's being held at the end of this month, and I believe, although don't quote me on this, that the topic for this year is related to energy transition, which is very interesting because right now we're seeing just absolutely, I mean, it's almost hard to imagine, but I guess you have to just accept that this is basically what they want, which is, what do they say? Let's see. Do they say anything about the theme of this year? Working together, restoring trust. Okay, maybe energy transition is only one part of it. So
Well, it
yeah,
does
they're doing a lot of
coincide.
things.
It coincides with the date in which the UN and the WHO are supposedly going to, finalize this uh,
Right.
international pandemic legislation that's going to trigger a law in the United States that was passed in 2005, which, if I understand correctly, does effectively give uh, Tedros, you know, Dr. Tedros, the fake doctor,
Yeah.
sovereignty over the United States health system if he declares the next pandemic. And
Yeah.
certainly that's when you say, well, they're backing off in Russia, they're backing off in America, in Germany, in Canada, they're backing off, but that doesn't mean the rules aren't still there. That doesn't mean they still don't have the enforcement police ready to roll out. And uh, so many people are just sending around these ideas that, there's going to be one this summer. They're going to launch a pandemic this summer, and then they're going to put in their regulation, and the health is that's going to be the beginning of the end of our sovereignty. over our health and everything else. So the coincidence of those two things just struck me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can just speak being here in Russia is that, like I said, Russian health ministry and all of the sort of health bureaucracy are saying openly there's going to be, like, we expect a new wave of coronavirus to come at the end of May. They're just saying this openly. And then also they're saying the severity of the wave will depend on how many people get vaccinated.
Hmm.
Like we should all get revaccinated, and that'll keep the wave, less
What
wavy. I don't
Fauci's
even know.
always, it's what Fauci was always saying before
Yeah,
he
yeah.
kind of disappeared.
And I think the question of the World Economic Forum and Russia specifically at this point is a really interesting one. And so I mean, obviously, basically because of sanctions, Russia has, or the World Economic Forum severed all ties with Russia and all the oligarchs that would go to Davos each year. The thing for me though is it's almost, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but what I would focus on, I think that the debate over whether, Russian oligarchs are working cahoots with Klaus Schwab is not really the most important thing. I think the most important question we should ask ourselves is if we believe in this concept that there's this great reset, which is some sort of blueprint to transform every aspect of our life with absolutely no consent. Just the total shredding of the social contract between government and citizens without any sort of input on our end. If we believe this is happening, and personally I believe it's happening, all we have to do is ask ourselves over the last 2.5, 3 months since this alleged breakup between Russia and the World Economic Forum, has the World Economic Forum's agenda uh, accelerated or has it been pulled back? And in my opinion, I mean, I think that they're ticking off a lot of boxes right now. We have an impending global food crisis, at least one we're being told that's coming.
Yeah.
Very, very serious energy crisis. In Russia, they've already openly talking about using the digital ruble
Hmm.
to better trace funds and also to bypass sanctions. Um, I mean, basically, all of the main agenda items, in my opinion, are being pushed forward. Have made have been developed. They're accomplishing what they allegedly set out to do. I don't see the last 3 months as a time when Klaus Schwab would be weeping alone in some urine stained corner. I think he's probably pretty happy right now. So.
Mm. Well, yeah, I don't like it when Klaus is happy. No, no, he's not one of my good guys. But and the other issue that actually you guys covered a little bit when you were talking with Whitney Webb at Unlimited Hangout a couple weeks ago was the issue of the financial system, and is Russia or are Russia and China going to create an alternate SWIFT system? And secondly, are they going to base it on either gold or some basket of assets, a commodity basket of commodities, like the idea has always floated that, hey, wouldn't it be better instead of having worthless paper currency that it was based on a basket of commodities? Oh yeah, that's really a good idea. That sounds almost as good as going back to the gold standard. Actually, better than going back to the gold standard. Yeah, let's do that. And then everybody leaves and goes home and it never happens because of the inertia. Just nobody wants to change, the way it is right now. But if Russia actually does have a big pile of gold and worked with China, and with China's much more stable economy than the Americans, it's possible. Do you see anything happening along those lines?
So there has been actual discussion about exploring the possibility of pegging the ruble to gold or commodities, as you mentioned. That's a real thing. The problem is that the Bank of Russia, central bank here, led by a woman named Elvira Nabiolina, tough one to pronounce, uh, has openly stated that it's not even up for discussion. She won't even talk about it. And to make it a little bit more frustrating, is it? I mean, assuming that pegging the ruble to gold is a good idea. I'm not an economist. I mean, it sounds interesting. It's like, yeah, it's worth a shot, I guess. The problem is that you're not allowed to peg your currency to gold if you're a member of the IMF. It's strictly prohibited. They even write it in their charter. You can't do it. You can of course peg the ruble to the U.S. dollar or to some other sort of uh, unit of value, but you can't do it with gold. They specifically say so. So in order for that to happen, Russia would have to leave the IMF. And so the question then becomes, is Russia prepared to do that? And my humble opinion is, under the current leadership, at least in this Russia central bank, I don't see that happening. Now, unfortunately, Elvira was up for re-election very recently. This was right after the conflict in Ukraine happened, right after half of Russia's reserves were seized by Washington and its underlings. There was a lot of anger directed at the Bank of Russia, and Putin decided to endorse her for another 5-year term, and she got it. So some have said, well, you can't change horses midstream, or it just wouldn't look good to dump her at this point. And also some have argued it couldn't possibly be her fault. Maybe she had no idea that this attack was coming, and if she did, why wasn't anything done about it? And is that even her responsibility? I don't know. But she's still at the Bank of Russia, and she claims that her bank, the central bank, is not even discussing the possibility of pegging the ruble to gold. So take that as you will. I don't know.
Well, once again, it's kind of distressing and depressing, because when people start these ideas and pass them around, it catches fire for a while, and you say, yeah, alternate SWIFT system, backed with real value, as no more paper fiat currency, and that would be attractive, just like the ruble is very attractive right now in terms of the financial markets. It's something we should also talk about. Is the last time you mentioned that you weren't too confident that this was a real solid recovery of the ruble, that it might have been something that they've been able to cover up the losses with savings or bookkeeping or something like that. Let's go there. How stable do you think the ruble is now, and will it hold its value?
So I don't want to knock the ruble. I'm not trying to rain on people's parades. So the ruble, if you just look at how it performs historically, is doing great right now. I think it's like what 65 rubles to the dollar, which actually is unusually good even before this crisis in Ukraine began. There's two things I would say though, just for people to keep in mind. Is one, that there are still very, very serious capital controls in Russia. So for example, if you are a foreign investor in Russia, you can't withdraw your investment. Like they're basically preventing people from basically transferring rubles into dollars in various ways. And in fact, another thing to think about here is that Russia's budget is not in dollars; it's in rubles. So it's not necessarily a good thing that you have a strong ruble if you're paying for everything in rubles. Like if the ruble is around 80 rubles to the dollar and you pay for public services using the ruble, why not have a 80 ruble, 80 ruble to dollar exchange? That's one thing. But you also have to remember that uh, the strength of the ruble doesn't necessarily reflect the strength of the economy. And for example, right now, since the last time we spoke, inflation has gone up. It's currently at 17.7%. 17.7% annual inflation. It's incredible. And the key rate, the last time I checked, maybe it's gone down, but I don't think so. Last time we spoke, it was 20%, the key rate. They dropped it down to, I believe, 14%. That's still unprecedented in any Western country. I mean, like they freaked out when the UK raised it to 1% or something, like last week. In Russia, it's 14%. It's we're talking about a situation where even the central bank has admitted that Russia is facing an economic crisis that is comparable to the 1990s. that basically right now what's happening is that because of capital controls and also using reserves to prop up things, that Russia is still able to, keep its head above water. But we're heading into an unpleasant time. I'm not saying that it's going to be apocalyptic. Possibly even it'll be worse in the European Union or the United States, but it's definitely going to be bad in Russia. Absolutely, no question about it. And I think, to be honest, I have to admit that I'm getting a little bit tired of these. You read on the internet and on Twitter like, ha ha ha, like inflation is so high in the United States, like unlike in, based awesome Russia. Like we shouldn't be comparing. Like we're all human beings and we're all going to be suffering economically, and also when I read these articles, like look at how there's not enough food on the shelves in Germany. That doesn't make me happy. Like I'm not like excited about that. I don't know. There's like this sort of weird boasting going on where it's like, look at these peasants in countries you don't live in that have been deprived of like basic necessities. Like that makes me sad, So it's the same in Russia, and I have not seen like food shortages or anything like that, but prices are going up. And when you live in a country where a large amount of people are pensioners who live on a fixed income every month, which is already quite modest, even, the price of a basic staple going up 15-20%, that's a serious problem for a lot of people. So it's unfortunate. I think we're really all heading into a world of economic pain. And I don't know how to prepare for it, except I guess stock up on what you need and hope for the best.
Did do they print currency when they feel like it in Russia? Do they say, well, oh, geez, money supply is too low. We better throw some more, it's what we call quantitative easing, just to keep everything liquid, keep it all flowing. You don't want your whole economy to crash just because there's a certain lack of liquidity. Let's just throw some more paper in
Right.
there. And so, because that's what's happened in the US, we have destroyed, 80% of the value of our currency in the past 2 years, in my opinion. And it's just now filtering down.
Yeah.
Right over here on the chat says we're at Zaganostra says we're at 8.3% in the US. That's bad,
Yeah.
but it's heading worse. And has this ever happened before? Yeah, it did happen in the Carter administration, in which I don't know if you remember a guy named Mark Rich, but during that time, when we went off the gold standard in '71, and that's why the gold standard is important, is because it locks the paper's value to how much gold is worth at the time, and it's a way to stop inflation from happening, but it does restrict the money supply. Now,
Yeah.
and that helps the elites, and we can go back and forth on whether it's good or not. But once we went off of gold in '71, then the inflation, was just an open Nelly bar the door, and it was people were borrowing at 20 and 21, 22% on their credit cards just to make their expenses. That kind of thing did happen here. It was a huge ripoff over, the secret pipelines and the just to say Americans haven't looked at this. You're right. It seems unprecedented because we haven't had this in a generation or more. But when it happens, it's bad. It's really
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, like cities,
Absolutely.
inner cities, it really suffer when this inflation hits because you're on whatever you're making, if it's Social Security or food stamps. A lot of people were on food stamps back then, and anyway, the horror of it falls always on the common people, and
Yep.
that's what they've been doing. Though I mean, look, I think it's all goes back to um, just the fact that money that is represented by paper and traded at a certain percentage rate, sooner or later, by just the interest, is going to be worth more than the capital was ever worth in the first place. And now you've got, I owe you, 3% of this and on a certain day, and you owe me 2% of that on a certain day. why don't we just call the whole thing off and start over? Have a jubilee. Let's have a biblical jubilee, and everybody's debts are canceled. That would be the solution. I'd love that. Let's just have a jubilee. But what it really is the desire for empire. And people who brag about, oh no, hey, look at those dumb savages over there screwed up their economy. They don't know how to run an economy. I know how to run an economy. Look at me, I've got a Mercedes. That mentality is the imperial mentality. It's the royals. It's the Morgans and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and all of them put together. Wouldn't give a darn if a genocide happened and famine happens, and we've seen it. It's probably happened in Afghanistan and Yemen and all around the world. They have steeled themselves so successfully that they don't feel a pang of guilt about it, and that's the force, I think, that is behind trying to impose this one world totalitarian system. Elites and just wanting to be part of the empire. I'm a baron, but one day I might be a count.
Yep. Yeah.
So it's a mental thing, and most people don't identify with that at all in this country, but our country's run by these people. Yeah, let's have a jubilee. Any chance of a jubilee over there in Russia? Can they just say, hey, let's just call it all off, no more debts, and start over, grow some food?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, it's also a big. I don't know if it's as big a problem as it is in the United States, but absolutely, when there's definitely a large percent of Russians who have taken on debt, and the current situation is definitely not good for those people. So we're all suffering, unfortunately, from the choices of our omnipotent masters.
Yeah, it seems that way. Why can't they just work it out? This. I look at Germany again, and who's really running Germany? Has anybody ever said, "Hey, I'm the person behind Merkel," or "We're running it"? It's probably the CIA. But what what's the future of Germany without Nord Stream 2, without Russia? Without Russia, Germany's, I mean, we can't supply them with enough fracked gas at any reasonable price across the Atlantic Ocean. What do you think? Let me also just give you a chance to respond to the news from Sweden and Finland that they may be joining NATO. That must be a bad thing for Russia.
Yeah, the NATO membership is definitely obviously not a good development. I would say it's unfortunately not particularly surprising. One of my reservations about what has happened in Ukraine, not trying to make a moral judgment or anything like that, is just I do worry that unfortunately, uh, if this conflict was designed to ensure Russia's security or neutrality of Ukraine, or keeping NATO in line, I don't think they're going to back down. I think everyone is going to double down. I think we're all going to be much less safe than we were a few months ago, unfortunately. And I'm not necessarily pointing blame at anyone, but unfortunately, it looks like this is the direction we're heading for. And there seems to be, I would say that the possibility of de escalation is much smaller than the possibility of serious escalation. Obviously, Washington has been less than helpful with trying to find some sort of peaceful, sane resolution to this. Moscow also plays a role and has responsibility in trying to bring an end to this. Ukraine apparently seems to be a puppet state with its people stuck in the middle of it. It's a total mess. It's really, like I said at the beginning of the show, I consider it a terrible tragedy for all Slavs. So that's my take on the NATO expansion. about sorry, what was the other thing we were talking about?
I was wondering if you had any comments on Germany and the
Oh, right.
Nord Stream
Y-
2, Gerhard Schroeder.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good question because also one of the interesting sort of well, if when you look at sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of Russia's economic model after the collapse, basically what happened was that a bunch of neoliberals came into power, were extremely instrumental in crafting Russia's sort of how Russia functioned economically, and their whole idea was we export, raw materials, resources to Europe. They make the stuff and they sell it back to us. Like that was the whole idea that Russia was this resource pipeline, not just oil, of course, all kinds of precious metals and you know uranium or whatever, And so basically, what has happened is now, I mean, Russia could probably still keep doing this. I would advise against it. They could probably still be a resource pipeline for China, other parts of the world. I would hope that this situation would encourage Russia to be a little bit better at being self-sufficient and producing much more than it has previously. But also what happens in Europe, which of course has incredible technological capabilities, does make a lot of stuff, but is heavily dependent on Russian raw materials and resources. So what happens now? This world that we live in requires partnership and cooperation. So what happens now is really a good question. I think we all have to think about because, like I said, I think economically, I think we're heading for a lot of upsetting developments, especially in like Africa and less developed places that actually depend on exports to feed themselves. That was another big thing, right? With the crisis in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine and Russia together supply an incredible large amount of just wheat to send to North Africa, to send to Lebanon. And what happens to these people? So it's really, gosh, what a mess. What an absolute mess.
I know. I wonder about it's summer coming. Is Ukraine going to be able to have a wheat crop, or is it is it going to? I would expect they could grow wheat. It doesn't. The war isn't everywhere. It's in certain parts, but huge amounts of land there. It's a huge country. Hopefully,
Yeah.
they can grow. But
Yeah.
but again, who's in control of it? Who can get it? What's the price?
Can you even ship it out of Ukraine though? That's the thing, right? I mean, it's
Interesting question. I was thinking about,
yeah,
every time I look at a map, I think about Odessa and, how close the Russian front line is going to go in terms of cutting off Ukraine entirely from the Black Sea.
yeah,
It doesn't look like they're going to Odessa right now. It looks like they're going to stop where they're at and just consolidate the Donbass region. It seems to be what's happening as far as I can see. I know you're not a war commentator, but the city of Odessa would be the port through which all of this grain would be shipped from Ukraine, unless some deal were made with Russia after a Russian takeover, which that NATO, of course, is going to try to prevent that. Well, and do you think do the Russians think about Odessa right now and what's going to happen there with regard to uh, that very essential port for Ukraine?
yeah. So again, this is not me. I don't pretend to have any sort of special expertise in this. I'm just giving you my opinion, but also the opinion. I keep a very close eye on Russian language media, and particularly there's a website that actually I encourage anyone listening, and also you, John, to check it out. It's called topwar.ru. And even if you don't read Russian, you can just sort of Google translate it. But it's one of the most popular military analysis and news sites in Russia. It gets something like 30 million views per month. It's like the number one top rated sort of national security uh, portal in the country. And it's quite interesting to compare their assessment of the military situation, just juxtapose it with what you might find on Twitter among sort of English language pundits who, in my opinion, have been maybe a little bit too optimistic and also too dismissive of some of the less attractive realities, and also maybe just having way too very, very high expectations for the Russian military to the point where it's just not practical. Now, when you look at the Russian analysis on, like, especially on the site Top War, you'll find that these Russian writers and analysts are stating very plainly that Odessa is off the table unless Russia at least has a partial mobilization. That it's not even worth talking about Odessa unless Russia begins to mobilize. The reason for this is not because, the reason for this is Russia is basically fighting the entire collective West at this point, and Ukraine mobilized basically within the first week. And whether they have highly trained troops or not is almost not the most important thing. It's that they can put a weapon in someone's hand and send them east. Now, obviously this is tragic because it just means more death, more destruction, more culling of the Slavs. But that's the reality. And Russia actually has a finite amount of troops, and they're not even sending conscripts in. Conscripts are very important. Traditionally, they're like the truck drivers. They're sort of the backbone of the military. They take care of a lot of logistics. Is fighting without even conscripts right now. So it has a hand tied behind its back. It also, you could argue that they're not, pummeling Kiev with missiles because they realize the futility of that. So Ukraine is fighting a real war. Ukraine is at war with Russia, whether it's declared or not. Russia is not fighting with its full force. And this is creating a situation where Odessa, in my opinion, and also the opinion of this website, which I encourage everyone to read, is off the table. It's not even worth discussing unless there are very, very serious changes in how Russia approaches the special operation in Ukraine. I mean, basically, they're saying we need a partial mobilization. We need to call up reservists. We need to send in conscripts. We need to mobilize the economy. These are all mainstream views among hardline supporters of this war. So it's just a very interesting juxtaposition if you compare what you're reading, in English language and what you read in Russia.
Thanks for that. And I'm definitely going to check out this site, topwar.ru, and try to understand it from the point of view that's presented there. That's great. I'm glad I asked about Odessa because that is a very important question. Just my own understanding was that they can't call up conscripts or involve the entire Russian military unless there's actual declaration of war or something like
Yep.
that, which would only come if there was an incursion into Russian territory. And so the Ukrainians have been careful not to do any actual incursions, setting aside a couple of special operations that we know about.
Well, I mean,
So in other words, the Ukrainians don't want Russia to trigger their mobilization. They're fighting maybe 20-30% of the capacity that they'd be fighting if Russia mobilized. Anyway, that's what I heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less correct, and you're correct to point out that the reason why Russia isn't using conscripts is because under Russian law, as I understand, is that you need a declaration of war in order to send them into a war zone. So that's a major hurdle for Russia, and I think it also people need to be realistic about whether or not it's even a good idea. If you really believe that Russia is, just a few weeks away from seizing Odessa or liberating it or however you want to describe it, I would maybe think carefully about realistically what's possible at this point. So
Good, and I'm relieved because that would be a horrible battle if they chose to
it would
fight
be
it.
a horrible battle. It would be a horrible battle. I think at this point we really all should be hoping for peace. I mean, I have since day one.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just, gosh, it's tough.
Okay. Well, all we are saying is give peace a chance.
Exactly, John. I like that.
All we are
Yes,
saying, give peace a
yes.
chance. All right. Thank you, Riley, for being with us again. And I look forward to this. I hope you can join me again next month for another update from Moscow.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure talking.
Okay, everybody. Edward Slavsquat at Substack and Riley Waggaman on Twitter. Thanks again, Riley.
Thank you, John. Take care, guys.
All right, we'll turn it back over to Neighborhood News Studio to continue our very, very interesting and and a very tightly packed day. So let's carry on. Thanks, John. I don't think your mic's on, John.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mike, John, I think you're muted there. We do have a great day scheduled ahead of us here at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We got George Webb joining us shortly. John, do you got your mic working now all of a sudden?
I think it's working.
There you go, buddy. So we got Mr. Webb joining us this very shortly. We're going to be switching gears here. We're going to be transitioning on the website, so make sure you guys hit that refresh button, and we'll be back after this introduction to Mr. Webb and the gang.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Research Roadshow with George Webb. Today is May 12th, and George will be joining us